My name's Tom White. I've been doing this meetup since when was it, Max? I think roughly 2017. I think.
That
Yeah,
would have been my guesstimate, yeah.
yeah, and yeah, it's sort of started very local, and now we're all over the world, which is kind of marvelous.
You
Okay,
should change the name of the meetup to Angular
Angular the
Worldwide,
world.
actually.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah, that would be good.
Angular Earth.
We might be competing with a few others then, I think.
If we're first, though.
That's true. Okay, so tonight I'm going to hand over to our first special guest presenter. We've got Stephen Adams, and he's going to be talking about how to write maintainable code. Over to you, sir.
Brilliant, thanks. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen and then start presenting. So, right, okay. So let's just keep it going. Okay, so what we're going to go through is what is maintainable code in Angular. We're going to have a look at two examples that I've created, two apps that are very similar. And I'm going to go through them and show you the code and show you what's the difference between them and why I think one of them is more maintainable than the other one. So there's two examples. We've got unmaintaiнаblebooks.com and maintainablebooks.com. Then I'm going to break down and just go through some of the points inside it and what I did to the more maintainable one to make it more usable for later on. And then we're going to go through a list of changes you can do to an existing code base that's quite hard to work with, how you can make that a little bit easier for yourself. And then, yeah, any questions or anything at the end. So it's quite short. We'll see how we go. So a little bit about me. As Tom said, my name is Stephen. I'm a UK contractor. Been doing this now for about 9 years. Well, contracting for about 9 years, and web developing now for about nearly 20. Been working exclusively with Angular for the last 5 years. There were some big clients using Angular. And as Tom said, I did write a book. It's called Getting Started with Angular, and it's available on EPUB. And I released the second edition sort of mid last year. So that's them. That's who I am. Right. So first of all, I'm going to show you the first example, which is the Unmaintainable books. So this is the site. All it does really is very simple. It allows you to search as a third-party API I'm using. It allows you to search for an author, and then you can see the titles of some of the books that they've got. It's very, very simple, doesn't do a great deal. But the most important part is actually the code. So if I go through that, I could show you some of the things that are in here and some of the problems that I can see with this. So if we start from the app module, which is here. So it all looks fine. You know, I've got some modules in here. I've got the nice app component. Everything is not too much going on here. It's just got all my modules in there. And yeah, it's pretty standard stuff. You see this a lot. Then if I go into app component, you can see not a great deal going on here. It's just a very basic title in there, and the template. We got all the this is built using the CLI, so it's got all the CLI stuff in here. And then we've got the templates down here. So then if I show you the other parts of it, so it's built out of two main parts really. We've got the main bit, which is the book list. Now, if I open up here, you can see now this is where I'm starting to. I've got my input, which is, if I go back to the site, is this part here. And then go back again. You can see I've got the details of the API that I'm using, which is this Random House one that I found. You can see now that I've got this. This is where I'm making the call to get the data. So it takes the value from the input field, gets the results, returns that to a nice local property. And then when you click on more details, it will give you more, makes another call by taking some more details, building up a path, and then returning the results. And if we go into the template, all you can see is there's my input field, there's my button for the clicking on, and then you can see I loop through the results and they are displayed using the Angular material cards. So this is basically all there is to the app. So it's quite simple, like I said. You know, it's got the main parts in it. It's pretty okay, but there are some problems with it that I think will make this application harder to maintain and work with as it grows. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you the second version, which is maintainable books. As you can see, it looks very similar. If I type in Dickens again and do search, you'll see I've got 2 results come back. That's what the API is returning me. And if I click view titles, we can see some of the titles here. So again, very similar, does the same sort of thing. But the code for this is very different. So that was the code for unmaintainable. If I go into the next one, so this is the code for maintainable books. So as you see, this is the module. It's a lot cleaner. There's not much in here. Then if I go into the component, again, very simple, not a lot in here. But what I have started to do in this one is I started to do routing here, and I'm lazy loading in these paths for the different modules. And one of the main things that you should think about when you're writing maintainable code is how we handle this app module. So as you can see from this one, as you can see, there's not a lot in here. There's just 2 submodules for the different features of the app, the searching and the details. If I go back to the previous one, you can see all these modules are in here. Now the problem with this is, as you grow, as your app gets more complex, you could be throwing more and more modules in here, and you could end up with a huge list in here of about 20 odd modules. And what this does is it can cause problems later on with performance and management of the application. It is one of the big things that the Angular team try and encourage people is not to put everything in that module, to keep everything more separate. So that's what I've aimed to do in this one. So what I've also done here is, as you can see, I've got 2 folders for each section, one for the searching and one for the details. If I go back to the unmaintainable books, there is one folder here that's just got 1 component in here. There's another section in here which is, well, it's empty. So what happened here was it was trying to show that it's a good idea as you're going and you're building out components, as you're building out your app, to make sure that if you're not using them, to keep them clean, to get rid of them, take them out. So this is an example of where I've rushed off and I've gone off and built all my sections. And I quite easily used the CLI to build this component, but I haven't actually got rid of it because I don't use it. I've just left it in the code, which can be a problem. Some other problems that I've got in here is there's a folder called data that I may have created early on to think about some mock data that I was going to put in there, but I haven't come back to keep it clean and remove that. So this is like an old folder that never gets removed. So if I came back to this application a few months later, I wouldn't know why that's there. So it's always a good thing to keep moving along, tidying up as you go along. If I went into the list component here, there are some problems in here that I fixed in the other version. So if I go into the details one here, expand it, as you can see, it's a lot cleaner. It's doing a lot of things differently. I'll go through those in a second. So the problems with this one is, as you can see, first of all, there's the APIs with the paths kept in the component. This is fine for when you get started and you want to quickly do something, but what you should really think about is keeping this information separate and in the environments file, keeping it out of here so you can adjust it later and never have paths hard-coded like this. I've got a property here that has no real name. It's not clear what this is for. It's got no types on it or anything like that to tell me what the data is. I've got another one called more details. Again, this has got no type. So I don't know what this data is when I came back to it. I wouldn't know what it is. And one of the other big problems here is I've also got this ng on it. So I'm not actually using this in this component. So it would be a good idea that you can take this out if it's not going to be used. Clear it out if you're not going to use it. And as you can see, I've got old commented code as well. That's not needed. So that can come out. Leaving uncommented code is a problem because if you come back to this application or somebody else is working on this later on, they have no idea why that's commented out. Is it just because you don't want to use it, or is it because for another reason? So you can end up having all these bits of code that are commented out, not clear why, and it's harder to understand what's going on when somebody comes back to an application and there's old bits commented out. Another thing in here is the method names are not very descriptive. Get data, more details, you kind of understand what they mean at the time, but if you come back here later on in say a couple of months and you've got to update this application or add something new to it, you're not going to know what this data is that you're returning. I kind of know it's about books, but I'm not really sure what type it is, and I'm not sure what the books is going to have in them. And then there's more details. It's not really descriptive about what are the details it's getting and what are these details? Why is this being used? So descriptive method names are really important to try and make your code more readable for later on when you come back, or you've got to add a new feature to it. You can take a component, open it up, and you can read and understand what's happening here with more descriptive names. Another problem with this is, as you can see, the component is doing direct API calls, and it's doing quite a lot of the functionality in this application. Problem with this is, if I want to have another part of my application where I'm making a call to this API to search on a title, I would end up duplicating this in another component, and then if I had another one as well, and you can see code becomes duplicated and it's hard to manage. So functionality like this, I think, should be moved into like the service layer. And then when it's in service, we can expose it to all the other components. So it's a good idea to keep all your functionality as much as possible, I would say, into a service, into the service layer than the component, and let the component just handle a lot of the UI, but not work that's going to be needed to be reused elsewhere. So this, while it's okay at the beginning, it does have a few problems. And as this application grows, if we carried on like this, I think this would become less and less more maintainable. But if I go back to my more maintainable one, as you can see, I've made some changes in here to fix those problems that I was just talking about. So in my book details, I've got a service, and I go into my service. You can see there, this is actually making the API call to give me the details on the author's last name. And you see I've given it more of a descriptive name. I've given it fetch book details. So now, first time you look at this, you understand that it's going to be fetching book details from an API. I've also given it types as well. I'm saying it's an observable. And I've also in here, I've started to create a model, like a domain language of the different data that's going to be used in here. So as you can see, I've got an author, and I've got the titles, and I've got like the information about the works of the author as well. So this is all different data that I can use to, when I come back or later on, somebody else has to look at, they can understand the data that's going through the application as they go. So what else is there to show? So if I go into the searching as well.
Stephen, I hope you don't mind my saying, I see Rovchen's got his hand up, and
oh, I can't see.
Yeah, it's all right. I thought you hadn't got that panel open, so I'll butt out. There you
go. Is there a question?
Yeah. So great stuff. Could you go back to service? I kind of pull request to review your code accidentally. But I noticed one method has observable any, right? So
yes, yeah.
accidental or on purpose?
let's just say it was an example. Yes, so I would use this. And obviously this could be something using one of my models here. So if this is returning the book details, I would turn this into something to use titles like that. So if I import that in there. So I know it's throwing an error at the moment. It's probably the wrong type. But now, when you think about
type HTTP too, by default, it doesn't know probably. So the HTTP get the diamond braces.
Oh yeah. So to have this.
Generic, yeah. To the left.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Just want to make sure.
Yeah. So that is a very good point. By just doing this, it makes it more. You now know what exactly is happening here. So the use of these types is so important, I'd say now, for not only make sure the data is fine, but it actually just makes this more readable. By just doing that, now we know that I'm bringing back titles from this API, and this is the data that's going to be coming back in. If I want to know later on what's in that data, I can just go straight into the model and just see that it's an array of ISBN numbers.
Thank
you. And as you see, I've done the same here with the search results. So I've got search results there, and if I want to see what's going to be returned, I've got my interface up here that explains exactly what the data is that's going to be coming back.
So another kind of point here, right? Your search result is a kind of private interface to this service side. Did you intend it to be hidden? Should it be in the types and exported as well for others to consume? Well, just curious.
It all depends. It can be. I think for this, it was just trying to show an example of how I was going to use an interface to make it, how you can use interfaces like this, not only for the data, but help to make it more descriptive of what's going on. So yes, this could be moved into its own model, its own TS file down here. But for now, I just put it in here just to sort of show that, yes, how useful these things are to make your code more readable. But you're right, that could have gone in here as well. But the idea really is what I'm trying to show is that these models, they can be built up to sort of give you like a description of the data through the whole of the application. So I know it's quite easy coming from like JavaScript, and when we used to do things, you didn't have to do that you wouldn't do that as much. You probably just put any in there as you start using Angular. But if you're going to carry on, I think it's well worth using these to build out that language for your application, so that people know later on, or when you come back to update it, you can see what's actually happening here. Is that okay? Right, I will carry on. So what else I've done in here is, as you can see, I've done folder by feature. So I've got the book details section, and I've got the book search. And if we look at the book search, you can see that I have really splitting this up into small components. So each component, so for the search form, while in the previous one, it was all part of the same template, this one now is all broken down into smaller components that are more manageable. I know exactly what they're doing. I can reuse them throughout, so that makes it more maintainable later on. So if I want to fix a bug, and it's a bug that's going on throughout the application, if the one component's the cause of it, fix that in one place, and throughout the app, it is working fine. The component level is quite simple, but in here, there are still problems again. So I've got any on the emitter types, as you was just saying, and also I've got empty methods here. So really, these should come out. I'm not using them. I don't need them. I can take them out. So, and then I can take this out, and yeah, there we go. That's a little bit cleaner. So it's just got the code in here that I'm going to use. Also, your imports as well. If you're not using them, you can take those out. Keep that nice and tidy. If I go into the results component, again, you can see this is a lot smaller, a lot simpler. just one method in here. So it's all very small and tidy little pieces that are, as the application grows, if I want to make changes, I don't have to trial through hundreds and hundreds of lines of code just trying to work out what's going on. Everything is quite small and separate and easy to maintain. And one of the other main parts in this application, even though they're not really written out, is I've got tests in here. Now, tests, I think, are very important for any code that you think is going to be used for a long time, because with tests, you can run them. And if you come back later on, when you want to update your code, having tests running just to make sure that any changes you make is not breaking anything is extremely important, I'd say. So in this version, we've got tests throughout here, which I will build upon as I build up the application. And I will add new features. I'll keep on adding to this test suite and slowly build it up over time. So as you can see, there are big differences between the two, even though the two are very similar in what they do and are very small. This approach where we are splitting everything up, we're making sure the code doesn't have more than it's needed in there. We're using services to handle the data, and we're using models to make it descriptive of what's happening. This, I think, is more of an maintainable approach. And this is what I've been trying to show in this version. So those are the two examples. And as you see, there are big differences there. So if I go back to the presentation now, and just going through this. So what's the problems in unmaintainable? Well, first of all, we saw we've only got the one main module. So that can be a problem if it grows. We put more and more modules in there, making it more complex and hard to update and slower. The variable names weren't very clear, so I was using things like data and more details. I didn't know what that data was if I came back to it, so it's not that useful, not that readable. Function names weren't that great. Get data is all right to get started, but it doesn't really describe what the data is and what's actually happening there. There were no tests, as I was saying. So that was a problem for if I make changes later on. I don't know what's breaking, if I'm breaking anything. And as I also said, the components had too much functionality in them, and they weren't using services to make some of this code reusable. And as we went through, it was using any, both of them were using any, but that is a problem because it's not really describing what's happening in that data. And we had some old code in there, again, that was not commented out. So when I come back later on, if there's a big chunk of code that's been commented out by somebody else or I've done it, it's hard to know why, what's the problem with it, is it supposed to be there? You know, we don't know. So it's always good to remove it. So then we went through maintainable books, and there were some positives in there. So I'm going to just go through what they were again. This code now is more structured clearly. Everything is in by its feature. The smaller parts, so it's cleaner and easier to understand and read. We had tests in there to solidify the functionality. So when we were making changes, we kept the tests running. We could see if we make a change or add a new feature, if it's broken anything that's already there. If there were any bugs with the way we structured it, being all small pieces, any bugs can be fixed, and they're not a massive, you don't have to trial through like thousands of lines of code just trying to fix one bug. So that's easier to do. Code can be more easily refactored because of our tests and because the code is cleaner. If I make changes and I've got my tests running, as I've said, if anything breaks it, the test will let me know. And as I build upon my tests, I've got more confidence in changes I make, so I can refactor as I need to be. Also, I think this code base can be easier for new members, because if you've ever worked on a project, what you'll find now with Angular being around for so long, I think we're finding that more and more projects, and as a contractor, I find this now, I'm not joining to start a new project from scratch so much. It's usually an existing application. And when you join it, if the code is all messy and it's all, everything's in components and there's everything in one module and there's no tests, it's a lot harder for you to get up to speed and to work out how this application works. The more maintainable approach is with all our smaller components and services and tests. It's easier for you to go through each piece, work it out, and see how the application comes together. It's more readable, and I can understand it better if I was working on it. And I think this is important for you team members when they come and join your application, and join your team and start working on the same app as you are. And one of the other things we addressed in the more maintainable books is we tried to give more descriptive names. You think about it, the Angular compiler doesn't really care about our method names because it all gets minified anyway. So I think it's a good idea to give things more descriptive names than say, get list of email addresses is more, it's more intuitive what that's doing than just get data. And a thing to think about is if you are going to give it a long name and you're starting to put two things in that name, like get list of email addresses and sort, that's a good indication that your method is doing too many things. And you should actually break that down to two separate methods, one to get the email addresses and one to do the sorting. So it's always a good idea to give them really descriptive names. And another, I think, benefit of maintainable code is when you start to work on a piece of code, it's quite easy to just, I've got a new feature, just open up your IDE and start hammering away, building out new components and services, using the CLI to create them all out for you. But if you take a step back and think about how you're going to make it more maintainable for the long term, you spend a bit more thought on it, and then you actually plan and structure it all for this long-term approach instead of quickly throwing the code together. It will make it easier for later on, for when you've got to update it, when somebody else has to come and work on it. And if we all start doing that, then the code that we're going to be writing should be easier for people to start working on as these applications grow. And those are the reasons I think I'll go through that. Oh yeah, right. So just to recap why I think maintainable code is important for us as Angular developers. So like I was saying, the first reason is you're not always going to be working on brand new projects. As I was saying, I'm a contractor and I've worked on a few Angular projects, and now I seem to be brought on more to help a team that's been working on something. For example, the current project I'm on, it's quite large. It's been written by the client as well as the team that are working on it. And the code base is quite big and the components are quite large. So it's quite hard to understand what's going on. But if you start to think about structuring your code in a more maintainable way, then when more the projects that you'll be working on and going forward, other projects, if we start taking this approach, will be easier to work on. And it's always a good idea. You won't be always working on brand new projects. So it's always a good idea to start thinking about this approach. Again, with these existing applications that we're going to be maintaining, if we take this more structured approach, it makes it easier to fix the bugs that we have or add new features. If we've got code that we can read and understand, it makes it easier to add estimates for time when a business is asking you how long something's going to take. If you know how the code works and it's quite well structured, you can give them a more realistic estimate than thinking, how am I going to get this updated to this existing code base that's a big mess? This is what I've just been saying. So as you can see, it makes estimates easier. When you're working with cleaner code, you don't have to go for the hoops and gotchas about making it run. Maintainable code, I think, can actually be more efficient if it's, like I said, more well structured. Not everything is in that one big module, and you don't have tons and tons of components in that one module. The application is going to load faster. It's going to perform better. So it's definitely, if you want good, fast Angular applications, looking at this approach is a good thing to do for the efficiency of it. And I also think it will make you a better developer because, like I was saying, instead of just open up your IDE and throwing everything together in one component or not thinking about how you're going to structure it. I think if you take a step back and start thinking about the readability of it and writing unit tests, your experience as a developer, you'll get more experience doing more things. You'll be able to think about code more clearly. You'll be able to think about your design patterns you're using, how you're writing your tests, how you're going to name things. And I think it makes you starting to think about writing code instead of just sitting there hammering it out. And you learn more by taking that step back and thinking about how you're going to approach it. And I think one of the most important things is we're not all working on applications of our own, we're all part of teams. So we've all had this where you work on a project, you open it up, you've seen what somebody else has done, and you've got to work out all the different steps to get it running. Then you'll spend half a day trying to work out what something's happening. But if we take this more structured approach where we break everything down, it's small pieces, and functionality is shared in services. I think it's going to make the whole team work together better, because we don't have to spend all the time trying to work out what somebody else has done or what this piece of code they've done, how that works. So I think that will make the team work together better. Okay, so the final piece is what things you can do if you have an application that you've been given to work on, but it's all quite messy. Everything's, like I said, it's got all these problems where everything's in a module, everything's in massive components, there's no services, no test, it's all just really, really difficult to work with, and it takes ages to get anything done. So here's some of the things I think you could start doing if you want to go from this messy code base to a more maintainable one. So the first thing you could start with is, if you can't make changes to the code itself, you can start to add unit tests to the functionality, just to give you that safety barrier of, at least with you've got tests, if they're passing, you can make a change. If they fail, then you know your change has broken something. So even though you can't make changes to the main code itself, you can start to add tests. So I think that's a good approach. Is the first thing to do, start small and build up these unit tests to give you that cover for when you want to start to refactor later on. Then I would suggest you start to move things into modules. You're not making massive changes to the component level or the surfaces, but you can start to create new modules, start moving pieces into these modules and adding them back, starting to split that massive monolithic app component into smaller pieces. And then that will allow you to switch things in if you want to rebuild a whole feature, or you want to update a feature. With modules, you can replace them as you've tidied them up. What you could also think about doing is, if you want to later on move things into libraries as well. So you have functionality that you want to refactor into a library. Once that library is ready and tested, then you can move that into your source, into your main code base, and then get it to replace the code that you find is really unmaintainable. So you can move things into smaller libraries as well. One thing though is you can't do all this in one go. So you've got to take your time, do small steps. It can't all be done in one sprint. So a good idea is to add some of these small refactoring or tidy up tasks in your tickets as you're going sprint by sprint and doing it slowly over time. So maybe take a ticket to add more tests to a section that's already been used, or create a new module for a small part and get that into your main module. Just do these bits, little bits. One of the most important things, though, is you need to get buy-in from the business. So they won't really care that your code base is not maintainable or easy to work with. What they really care about is the time and the money that it's going to cost. So if you can tell them by slowly doing these things and changing over time, it is going to save time later on. It's going to make it easier to update new features. It's going to make it easier to give them clearer estimates on how long things will take, because you now understand the code, you know which part you're going to be working on, and you know how long it's going to take. All these little things, if you can get that through to the business that this is going to help you and benefit things in the long term, then they'll slowly allow you to add more and more tickets into your sprints to start moving this messy code base into this more maintainable approach. And as I was saying, if there is resistance, you may have to say, okay, so say you've got a new feature, you've got a feature that you've got to update on an existing piece of code. You think it's going to take about 3 days, but this code is quite hard to work with and you're not too sure. So what you could do is you could say, well, it's actually going to take a little bit longer. Add a bit of time to these estimates just to do this time for your tests and your refactoring. So you can add these things as you're going. And then the more and more of that you've done, these estimates will come down. And then you can give them more realistic estimates over time. So that's the main bits of what I was going to say. I've got some links for you here. So those are the 2 repos of the projects that you've seen. The Angular style guide, the reason I put this in here is it's really, really useful. It's got some great ideas on how you can structure your Angular app. It's got some great ideas on how to use the features of Angular, like the services and the modules. And I do think this is a part of Angular that some people never see. So I really think this is quite important to spend a little bit of time to just go through this, see what they're saying, see how they're describing how you should build an application. And then there's some ideas in here that you can start adding to your existing app. Then we've got Maintainable Podcast. This is a great little podcast. And it's all about people who work on old existing applications and the ways that they go through turning it into more maintainable code and the ideas they have and how they tackle it. So that's quite a good, it's got some good tips in it. It's not really Angular heavy, it's more Ruby and Rails, but it's got some great advice in here. So that's well worth listening. There's a great course. I'm not sure if anybody else has been on this, but it's all about testing. And as I was saying, testing is really important to build up that barrier for when you want to refactor your code and switch this more maintainable approach. So this is a great course if you want to learn more about testing. And finally, I've got this this great talk here by Katerina, where she goes through adding solid design principles to your application. And if you watch this, you can see the ideas that she's saying about how you can make structure your code. So it's got small pieces, they all do their own job, and they all come together to build a more flexible and manageable application. This one, I think she's doing it in Python, but again, the principles are the same and they are it is well worth watching this. And that's it, really.
Stephen, could I request, could you share a link to that presentation so we could get those links there, or paste those links into the chat?
I will do. I will do the link for the presentation and I'll put those in there as well. Actually, I'll go back to them in case you want to have another look. Yeah, so any questions? Anything on that? I can't see, so I'm going to stop sharing.
Not a question per se, but I think one of the things I really liked that you pointed out was that when you have the name of a method which contains sort of more than one task, that being a hint to split the functionality into multiple concerns. It's funny enough. I've had similar thinking in the past where it's difficult sometimes to know where to draw the boundaries between things. But if you, as you become more experienced, you sort of pick up these little indicators, and that's for sure a really good rule to follow to help you kind of enforce single responsibility, I found. Yeah, I thought that was quite useful because it just flags that you're thinking, I'm doing too much in this method and it's going to be doing too many things. Same with services as well. You know, I see some places where they're doing too much. They're getting data from an API and then they're doing something else with it and doing something else with it. And it's all sort of related, but your service is doing 6 different things when really you should just do one thing. I mean, having a service that's small, it's fine. I think is a better approach. And you can have multiple services all working together, doing their own little bits instead of one that does everything. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So that's.
I think you're better off, like you said. I think you're better off having more smaller sections than fewer bigger, more complicated things, because it's always easier to recombine things than it is to sort of split them out. So yeah,
and it sort of harks towards the atomic design principles, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So the other thing I liked, Stephen, was the fact that you pointed out the descriptive naming convention. So effectively having almost a sentence as a function name or method name, and even a class to describe what it's doing is really sensible. It's less commenting then.
Yeah. There was a book I read absolutely years ago. I think it's a classic, that Clean Code book. I forgot, by Stephen something, not Stephen Adams. He wrote another book, and that, even though that was, I think that was using C++ back in the day, the principles in that in Java as well. But again, a lot of those ideas from that I still remembering, and I read that ages ago. So that is that's
Is
good.
it Robert Martin?
No, Stephen Mack something.
Okay.
I can't remember. I will have to have a look.
One thing I've seen a lot of before is you mentioned about sort of splitting code out, that people try to make a reusable component, but then add a ton of logic in it, and then they're actually making it unreusable because it's got if do this, and it becomes an absolute nightmare to try and actually use that component. So and also if it's a large scale project, changing it is ridiculously difficult because it could be, that component could be used in 50 different places. You go and make one little change to it, and there you go. You've just broken the rest of the application.
Exactly. Yeah. And there's what I see so many times.
Yeah.
These massive components, tons of work in them, and like that example you're saying when you've got if statements, those if statements could all be their own separate method which describes what they do. So that makes it more, again, you just look at that and you get all the names of the methods, and that makes it, you understand what's going on instead of having to work out, well, what's this if statement saying, and what's this one saying, and why, even just working out what that little method's doing. If you break it down into methods that have all got descriptive names, it just makes it so much easier for later on.
The interface on the API calls as well is massive, because the amount of times you see people put any there, and if you're not familiar with the backend or what it's actually supposed to be returning, it becomes a nightmare to debug, because it could be anything that's going back from that. So I like that. Yeah,
so I work on a project with a load of C# developers, and they are really, really good at that. Everything they do has a type.
Yeah.
I mean, they're picking it up all the time, just saying, what is this type? And they're always matching what's on the C# side is the same that we're having in TypeScript. And that's one of the great things I think about TypeScript, is you can have that, very similar language, shared models, not shared models, but you have the same models you would have in the TypeScript you have in the C#.
Yeah.
And the .NET guys are just all over that. And it's something to really, really, that I'm really starting to stick to and picked up from working with those guys. So it's definitely a good idea.
Cool. Any more questions for Stephen whilst he's pasting his links in?
Oh, crap. Yes, he is. Yes.
Subtle hint.
There's me waffling away. Sorry. Right.
Cool.
I have a question. So basically, something you mentioned is also something I often hear, which is try to have only whatever the user interacts in the component, right, logic, and then everything else put out into the service. How do I say this? Do you see any reason why, or what would be the reasoning behind not simply creating, let's say, some static class methods within the component? If this is really independent logic, you put this in, you get some logic out or something like this. What would be the plus side really having it totally separated? Of course, unless the component itself is huge, then it makes sense to separate them, right? But is there any other logic of why should we really put them away and have them, each service, each component then has to have its own service, basically, right, for the testability?
Well, you can have a component that has some functionality in it. So what you might normally do is you might have so say you're building a page and it's got, so the example I had, so it's got a text box and it's got the results. So that could be 3 components. You could have the first one, which is the page component. Now that doesn't really actually show anything. That is the one that's got the services getting your data in, and that's got doing some functionality. And then what that's going to do is just pass that data straight to the child components, which are your dummy ones, and they don't know anything about services. So this parent one can do a bit of that logic in there, but as soon as you think, all right, I'm doing another part, so later on you've got to do a new feature, and it's very similar, and you feel that it's very close. Any of that functionality that you have in the first component, the first page component, that you think you're going to need elsewhere, it's then time to move to a service so that you can share it. So anything that's going to be shared should be in a service. So you don't have that problem where you've got one component that's doing something, and there's another one, and it's duplicating code all throughout. If you can refactor it into a service, that's a better approach. But you can have components that do a little bit of functionality, but they're usually what are called like smart components. They don't have much in the UI. They just talk to services, do a bit of work, and then return that data. So they might take 2 bits of data from a service, like getting usernames and getting email addresses from 2 places. Don't know why you do that, but they'll get them together. In that parent component, it may put them together and sort them, do something, do that, get that data ready to just pass into those display components that you'd have. That's something made that show them in a table. So that is why you might do that. But then as soon as you start to think, I'm going to need this elsewhere, you can start moving things into your service layer.
Yeah, I mean, on that topic, I would just like to kind of throw out one thought. I think something which is not often enough used in Angular, I mean, the code bases I've seen so far, right, is actually extending components with similar functionalities, right? So actually building some base component and then extending them. And I think this is something I've learned in the past, I've seen in the past. It can be extremely useful also, and you know, to probably, I mean, I'm guessing here, help with maintainability as well, right? Or don't you think so?
I could comment on that, but Stephen, if you get stuck in,
I also, after you two guys,
I think we've all got opinions on this.
Yeah, sure.
Shall I go first thing? All right. Okay. So I think coming from a C# and Java background, it's a natural choice to think in terms of inheritance and object-oriented programming. The only problem with inheritance is when it goes too deep. So if you inherit from, it can be really difficult to find where you are, what the hell's going on. One of the things that I've noted sort of in conversations with other technical architects is that they tend to apply one rule, right, which is inheritance is a good thing for frameworks and sort of applications that do jobs that you sort of use as tools, and then configuration components are often better for large-scale app developments. Okay, but it's horses for courses, and it ultimately comes down to what you feel you can maintain the best. Does that help? That's my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to hear more opinions, because like it's something that I'm kind of, you know, throwing around ideas with some components that I see perspective usefulness, but on the other hand, yeah, what are the pitfalls that I can get into?
Yeah, I'm kind of similar to you, Tom, actually. I went down when I first started using Angular and using obviously TypeScript on the front end. My background was more object-oriented languages, and I found myself going very initially going into the sort of OOP route, using a lot of inheritance, and I very quickly tied myself up in knots. And I think that is the danger that you get into with OOP. The reason I thought this is an interesting time for me to weigh in is because the talk that I'm going to be doing soon in this meetup is about component-oriented architecture. And so I think particularly on the front end and with TypeScript, it lends itself more, in my view, not always, but mostly to sort of functional programming and building things as components and using them as building blocks. So sort of slotting things together instead of making this a sort of heritable inheritance tree. So I tend to avoid having components inherit. I don't think Angular really works that nicely with it anyway, because you can't really inherit templates too easily, that kind of thing. So I think if you think, for me anyway, I've had more success thinking of building reusable components and then, like I said, slotting them together instead of inheriting functionality.
I think following on from that, just to add briefly to that, without trying to steal too much of these words, is I've actually encountered when I'm creating a publishable library, such as a form builder, then inheritance is really useful, because when you've got form elements that have something in common, having an inherited component, a base component that they all inherit from, makes absolute perfect sense. But I have seen it used, for example, in XPlat for native script, that they've got a base component where they inherit the onDestroy method to unsubscribe from subscriptions. And personally, my rule is don't fix the framework. So I don't think that's a good place for it. Does that make sense?
I also want to weigh in a little bit. So there's material implementation of CDK, right? So you have different functionality from CDK that material implements in Angular community, right? So we, as a company, we also wanted to use that, but then we decided to customize the look and feel. So what I did, I literally went to material code source base, look how they do that. And their components mostly extend Angular CDK base component, which provides behavior, right? So as you guys were saying, right, for extending templates, it might not be a good candidate, but for extending behavior, it's seemed to be a very nice candidate, even though there are some challenges to get reference to components, like future component even. But it's definitely like, it felt like very natural to share behavior that way. So most of the behavior was provided by CDK, whereas the look and feel I could provide, or material library provides. So that was like a rare use case where it's really shined for me in our team. And I extended even 2 times. I had 3 levels of extension because I had different types of, so I had different types of stepper, right? Where you have first content, second content. So I had model version and page version. So I had the base component that had similar behavior. And then that was extended to look different. So just an example of how we used it.
Yeah, thanks everybody. I think that was very useful insight from all of you.
I thought that was excellent. Yeah, that was great. It's collaborative. Yeah, collaboration. Do you mind if I instigate a round of applause for Stephen's presentation whilst we're here? You can do it with the microphone on or off.
I know it's a happy sound. I don't know. Hopefully it's not happy.
Thanks, guys. I suppose I can kick off my presentation now, or if you want, we could have a quick vote, and I could give you a quick break if you need it. So all those in favor of needing a break, you can raise your hand now, either visually or virtually. Yeah, we've got a few hands up, I think. Okay, so yeah, let's take like a 5-minute break. Is that all right? Yeah. So we'll come back here. In 7:05. Okay. And I'll kick off. Okay. Thanks, guys.
Tom, what's the second topic?
Right. So my topic, yeah, it's all about modules and configuration. So it's about module imports, forRoot, and injection tokens, and that kind of thing, and basically recipes for how to get around certain levels of disaster.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Is that okay?
Good.
All right. See you in a bit.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Hi, Max.
Hey, Tom.
Hi. Right, we're still on record. I thought I'd just let it run as I do. Hi, welcome back. We're all drifting into the room. Oh, hello again, Pav. Nice to see you.
Hello again.
Do you both work for LNG?
Yeah, D&G actually.
Sorry, D&G.
Another set of initials with G.
I always get them confused.
And also a company that deals in insurance. So it's a very similar conversation.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure I've called up LNG about my dishwasher in the past.
Oh, yeah, the wrong people. Yeah, whoops. Okay, looks like we're definitely mostly back, which is marvelous. Okay, well, thanks for coming back. Hopefully you're going to stay.
They're always going to come back.
To be interesting. Yeah.
For your talk,
Good.
particularly Tom.
Okay. Hopefully. Oh, yeah. I'm just going to check the chat, and I see. Yeah, Stephen's given his link to his presentation, so you guys can tap into that reference material. So that's great. Okay, so I'll get started with my stuff. So I think the right thing to do is probably to present. So what I'm going to do is move that window over there. That's better. Now I can see you. And now I'm going to present my screen. And oh dear, right. I thought I could present from that one. Oh dear. Right. That's unfortunate, isn't it? I've made a boo-boo. Right.
Do you need a few minutes?
No, I don't. It's just I don't want to cancel this call. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to re-enter the meetup, which is embarrassing, but I'm going to come from another screen. Okay. So. Okay.
Well, that's pretty cool. But you muted.
But that's
Working.
Right, I'm going to kill this one and see if it works. Right, oh goodness, that's high risk, isn't it? I tell you what.
Can you just unsubscribe from First and White?
Yeah, I think I'll have to keep this one open. Damn it, I've got to present. Let's try again. So present entire screen. Oh dear. Oh, that's embarrassing. It's because I'm doing it on Firefox. I do apologise.
Can I help at all, Tom?
Yes. Well, what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to try and switch again and stop showing my video here. Let's see if I can do this properly. So right, that would do it. Yeah, I'll do it as a different account there. Now I'm good. Right, I'll mute.
How many software developers do you need to present? Apparently at least 2 accounts.
16.
You're muted, Tom. Can't hear you. Oh, he's chatting away.
There
you are.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, yeah.
Thank goodness
Yes.
for that. That was a bit of a terrible one. Sorry about that. Right. Now, I can do this a bit more professionally from now on. So let's do a share, send now. There. Can you see my presentation? Yeah?
No.
Oh, yeah.
Not yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, that's embarrassing. Right. Let's screen one, share.
That looks better.
That's it.
There we
Yeah.
go.
Got it.
Yeah, it's good.
Good, at last. Right. Okay. So, the presentation's about mostly forRoot and getting your configs right in your modules. Okay, so let's have a little look at this. I'll just do this. Here we go. Right, so what I'm planning to talk about is how to load a runtime config. And then after I've done a bit of that, then I'm going to say, whose injector is it anyway? That's so I can talk about things that have confused me when I've done injection in various places. And then finally, I'm going to talk about refactors when I'm using the enterprise Angular monorepo patterns and their constraints from third parties when you're loading their modules. Okay. So let's get this in a good place. Where's my code gone? Right, so here's a repo, and I'm gonna send you a link to an opportunity to have a look at this. So if I hesitate too much whilst I'm demonstrating this, you'll be able to interact with the actual repo. Right. So this repo consists of like 3 branches, and you'll find details in the README. I might as well drag that over here and kill that one. Right, so it's got a section on each bit that I'm going to present, and you'll be able to find links to the files that I'm going to talk about. So the first part of the demonstration, how to load a runtime config. I don't know if you guys have tried to do this before, but the default way of building an Angular app is to use environment.ts to set up all the configuration values. But the problem with that is that it only gives you information at build time. And I don't know if you've got any fussy DevOps in your projects, but the guys that I'm dealing with currently, and certainly the project that I used to work on before that, they didn't like the idea of rebuilding, or in particular doing npm install at every point through the CI environments and then finally to production with node modules that could potentially contain vulnerabilities. So the way they like to work is to work with a built version that's tested and keep that bundle together and then work it through the environments so that they've got a known tested bundle. Does anybody else work that way?
Yeah, we do. And we also use app initializers for getting the async config. So this is perfect.
Oh, good. Right. So there's more than one way to skin this cat, okay, to use a coin of phrase. And I'm going to show you the way I've found that allows you to do it all in the same module, basically in the app module in the root of your application. I've seen other ways of doing it, but I believe that this is probably the most efficient. So let's dive in. Within my app, and you can clone this repo and have a look and start asking questions. I've got a module, okay? And hopefully you can see my code.
Yep.
Yeah, it's all fairly legible. Right. Mm-hmm. So the key part of this loader is this. It's using the app initializer, the app initializer injection token in order to use the Angular framework to trigger this particular provider before the rest of the modules configuration and imports load. Has anybody else used app initializer before?
Yes, I've used it.
Getting a few nods, that's good. So in this particular example, what I'm doing is using the app initializer to trigger a load async config factory, which injects config service to do the work for us. And what that does is up here in the load async config factory, it hydrates the build config service and then calls the load config method on the service whilst passing in a hard build time variable from the environment file to get the path to the config file. Okay. So if I jump into the service, you'll see that it's a very simple HTTP call. Okay. And it's just getting the config object from a JSON file. And I'll show you where that is. That's in my config folder in the root of the application. And the file is just called config.json. Excuse me. So you can see it's just got a couple of dummy values in there. Okay. And in my environments file, you can see there I've got the path to the config file. Okay. So pretty straightforward. Now we get into the tricky bit. Okay. Because it's all very well to load the app initializer, but you can't really pass that round as an injection token to get at that config. So the thing to do is to use the service to load the config, and I'll go back there. And what it's doing is it's actually storing the config in its local state. Okay. And then it's got a getter for the whole of the config. And then finally, a getter for some specific library config. Okay. And then if I jump out to the app module again, what you see here is I'm setting up a new injection token. And that's using a similar factory. And if we go up here, it's using the same service, but this time it's doing the get library config. And then finally, using that config token as a value, or it's a value that gets hydrated at runtime. Okay. And then passing it in as a token to the forRoot of my shared library. Okay. So in other words, these two steps, they take place consecutively because the app initializer is a framework specific Angular defined token that's triggered before the app spin up. And then immediately after creates this token based on a value that it's extracted out of the same service, and then passing that value at runtime into the import of the forRoot of the shared library. Okay, so it's a hop, skip, and a jump. Okay. Can I see a show of hands just to see how many of you have used injection tokens? Okay, it doesn't have to be on video. You can put your hand up on the actual bar button so I can see some votes. Look at that, we've got loads. Right, and I reckon we're talking, roughly speaking, getting on for nearly half the audience, which is just perfect. It's just quite what I was expecting. That's good. All right. So I don't know what you guys think about this, but I was pretty proud of the fact that I managed to get that to do that consecutively, because the problem with the schema in modules, and if you fiddle around with it, you'll realize this, that it's all static. You can't pass a service into a parameter in a forRoot. There's so many limitations that you have to use tokens, and you've got to hydrate them in a specific way. Any questions?
So can you say that last bit again? You can't pass a service into a parameter. Oh, I see.
You can't get it in there.
Yeah. So yes, okay, yeah. So you're exposing like a static module to do some configuration and some hydration for a particular module. Yeah, and you can't give it parameters. I was going to say it's very clever the way you've exposed the config via the DI, like cached it on the service using the return library config factory. So that was very smart.
Thank you. I appreciate the compliment. Has anyone else got some questions? I see Pav and Dav both have hands up, but maybe you just left them up. Dav hasn't, right? Okay. Oh, we've got David. Excellent. Have you got something? Oh, and Pav potentially. Have you got something to say?
No, I just want to say something. In my authentication library, I'm actually passing as a token a relative path to the config.json file where it's actually located. And then once I pass it as injection token, when my module gets loaded, the API service then basically reads the config file based on the relative path to which was passing the token. And then I call the APIs. So, hi, Dawal. So I've been just thinking...
good. My mic wasn't working. Sorry, I was just testing. Sorry.
It's all right. So I've been thinking, could I just simply, because different projects might put the config.json in different places, so I should just extend the factory to accept parameter of a relative path where the config.json can be located in a project. Then your factory, upon the app initialization, to read that, and then I could put in a token and actually pass it this way, if I understand correctly, right?
Yeah, I must admit, Pav, although I see your point for maybe wanting to call out to a service, call out to an API or call out to a config file from within your lib. Personally, to me, that's kind of like not encapsulated. I prefer the app to do the heavy lifting and give you that data, however it's got it, and pass it in a sort of agnostic kind of way. Does that make sense?
You could get multiple API calls as well, couldn't you, if you're just passing the path to the config to a module?
Yes.
Like duplicate API calls by mistake.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's right. So I'm just favoring slightly getting the data before you sort of instantiate your library module. I don't know how you feel about that, Pav.
No, I feel good about it. I didn't really understand that. I didn't understand what you meant by I could get multiple calls. So I was also thinking basically how to read the config.json and then inject it forRoot for my module, and then I just simply thought, okay, but if different projects are gonna have the file in different places, I just thought I'm gonna pass the path, and then as my module gets instantiated in the service, I just simply put that read config based on the relative path in my service and keep the instance of it there. And obviously, if it's null, I just read it again and then reuse it across my APIs just for that particular service. But seeing how you did it here, I think I could just extend the factory to basically just accept the parameter of where the config.json is located and pass it that way. So I like it. And I think I might refactor into that. Yeah.
Excellent. All right. We've got something out of it. That's great. Oh, have I got any other takers?
Can I ask one question, Tom?
I suppose you can, Deval. Go on.
One question. So when we pass forRoot and we pass in the token there, when is the token going to be hydrated? It's not going to be hydrated, like it will be when you inject it in the consuming module, correct?
So the token is provided right here.
Right. So the factory method, like return library config factory, that actually brings this token to life, would be called when this token eventually gets injected into a service somewhere, right?
Yes.
Okay.
So it's lazily.
So in other words, you're right. The service is really there for the app's specific components that might want to inject that service and get those config values. But in the case of the lib, okay, which is here, it's agnostic. So you don't want to trust that service is there. You actually want to pass that config directly in as kind of like a parameter that can be accessed from within the lib. And I'll show you that there because it's worth drilling into. Okay, that then takes that same token, okay, and uses it with a use existing to hydrate its own token that it then uses for injection later on. And I can show you where it's being used. Okay, there you go. That's the magic right there.
So that inject would actually in turn hydrate everything, right?
Yes.
And then you could just do this.config inside of that component, can't you? Is that right?
Sorry, Sam.
Then you could just do this.config inside of there, and you'd have access to it.
That's correct. Should we have a look?
Yeah.
There you go. So it's in the template, and I'm just using the JSON pipe to get the config. Would you like to see that in action?
Yes, please. The only other question I had was on the app module. You used multi-true, and I just wondered what that was doing. I think it allows you to provide multiple injection tokens, doesn't it? But I wasn't sure how you actually used it there.
Sure.
May I request that you guys turn your mics off if you're not speaking, because there is a hot mic out there.
Yeah, there is, isn't there? There's a bit of a slap back.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh yeah, that's a bit tidier. Yeah. Okay, so my pausing there was unnecessary. I'm going to pull this back in. There, can you see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, so
yes.
So here's the app component. It's displaying the config that it's injected and then got from the service. And then here's the lib component, and it's showing via the the JSON pipe to show the bit of config that it got specifically from its config token. Okay,
cool.
And you're welcome to explore the app, and you can just play around with that and do as you will. All right.
So, in fact, before I butt in, there's a few other people with their hands up, so I'll let them go ahead.
So we've got both Deval and Astrides. I hope I said that again. Aristides. Yeah, sorry.
You can call me Aris if you want. That's okay, because it's a Greek name, so it's very difficult to pronounce. I would like to ask if the app initializer provider must be provided inside the app module, or can we place it in another module?
Excellent. So as long as it's imported directly into the app module, then it can be in another module. So Let's talk about that. So say, for instance, it's imported at this level, okay, then that module can use this. Okay.
So it just can't be a lazy loaded module, essentially.
Correct. Okay. Are you happy with that, Aris?
Yes, thanks very much.
You're welcome. I'm going to actually show you an instance of that shortly, because if we go on to point 3, you'll see that. So
I have one question.
Go ahead.
I mean,
Ahead,
but this doesn't then enable us in any way to access it from another library, which is dynamically imported, right? That's then a no-go, or it still functions?
So in another library, you say?
Yeah, basically we have a monorepository, right? I mean, currently we're solving it really just having another module and then dynamically set the environment module, variable there to basically make it accessible everywhere. And I'm just wondering if this is something I should look into that could be potentially compatible or not. So
one of the ways that you could make it available everywhere is to just reference the build config service. Okay, so now that we've used that step to hydrate the config service, okay, you can inject that anywhere in your application and any libs because it's already provided at the root level. Okay, however, it's a bit of a tall ask for shared libraries that you want to publish. Okay, because
not that. That's just internal. Yeah.
Provision at the beginning, but in a monorepo, when you're modularizing your code into libs, and you know that lib is a part of an application, then it makes sense to just trust that that provider is happening above that module, and therefore you can just inject the config service. And I'll show you that in the app component. Very obvious. That's all you do. Okay.
Okay, great. So there really should be no problem with actually using this principle as well.
Absolutely.
Monorepository at least, right?
Yeah. The constraint that I've given myself in this example is just purely for a published lib where you don't know if your app is going to provide the config service. So therefore, you've got to take your stuff in as a parameter.
It's also good. I think it's also good for as like a separation of concerns.
Exactly.
So this way your feature module doesn't have to know anything at all about a config service. It just defines exactly what it's expecting in terms of configuration. Obviously, if it's just internal code, it's not such an issue. But yeah.
Cool. Do you mind if I move on to point number 2 and try and speed up because I'm talking really slowly? And I don't want to make you go to sleep. So I'm going to do whose injector is it anyway? Okay, it's just me being slightly geeky humorous. Here we go. I'm going to switch branches and I'm going to go to whose provider is it anyway? Okay, and now we're going to see some extra stuff. Okay, a couple of what you'll have noticed on the screen is that suddenly I've got a bit of commented out piece of code, and I'm showing the same forRoot config token over here. I'm going to close all the others, and I'm going to take you into this lib. And I just thought I'd show this because I'm rather than actually demonstrate, because it just gets a bit tedious. This is a recipe. This is just a trick, okay? So you remember I'm creating a library config token to get my config available as a provider throughout my private published encapsulated library. What I've also created over here is an alternative library token that if I don't call forRoot in my application, then I can use a default provider instead. So what it demonstrates to me, because it was an exercise, is that these providers happen first in the tree, and then this provider overrides any duplicate statements, but does not replace any ones that are not duplicate. Does that make sense? So it's 2 tiers of an injection tree. Does anybody have any questions?
No, not me.
Oh,
Why
cool.
would you? Sorry, Tom. Why would you use that? Is that because you may have smaller? Say you got an application that has loads of what do I call it, like smaller applications inside, and each of those may have their own config, but they're based off the parent application. Is that why you would use that?
That might be one, or you might need a default configuration in case your library would explode without providing a forRoot.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you might want something special to happen if a forRoot has not been made available. Okay, and you can do that by that. Okay, however, it does lose the benefit of when you do one forRoot in the root of your application and then import that module deeper in your application on various pages or branches of your app tree, then the forRoot provider that you injected will get overridden by your override. So it's not a perfect solution for all cases. It's just an application. And the reason I did it actually was to prove that this gets overridden by this, but most importantly, your providers here are independent of this and do not get overridden by that. Does that make sense? Cool. Whew. Now we got through number 2 quite quickly. However,
sorry, Tom, I've got a question.
Quite sorry.
Yeah, no, sorry. I mean, I've seen the forRoot a lot of places, but I've also seen forChild. So where would like some people do that? So when would the scenarios that you use forChild and not for Yeah,
well, it's a good point. So for child, you can make it have a different behavior and be dependent on the providers that you've created in your forRoot to sort of integrate that linkage. In certain cases, that's not really required, but if you're trying to preserve singletons, you can do some funky code by having both of those. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, that's what I was trying to find out why, because I've done it like forRoot and I've seen forChild, and I've just never like known when to actually utilize them. I think forChild is for when you're doing lazy loading. I've seen it mostly doing that, but again, I didn't really understand why. So yeah,
I've seen a bit of that too. I've just found that maybe the way to deal with it is to just have the provider in the forRoot and then not bother with any method on the end of it for the rest of the imports. But I think you've got the point that when things are lazy loaded and you're in a deeper part of the application, the behavior of what you've done in the forRoot might be a bit different. So you've got to have a forChild in that case. But I'm not really exploring that right in this example.
Hey,
okay.
Hey Tom,
cool. All right.
I think I'm on the second page, so when I raise my hand, probably you don't see my hand raised. May I ask a question?
Oh, sorry.
No problem. So
go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I do have a question. If you brought the app initializer and put it in this module, where the provider, instead of putting it in the main app, and then renamed this shared module to a config module, then the user of this module, which you publish individually, wouldn't really need to know about the app initializer or anything. And all they have to do is just call it .forRoot pass the config environment in, and then anybody could now inject the service in at their will. The other thing that we have to do is to protect the environment, because if we pass by pointer, anybody could mess somebody else's environment. So we have to do a read-only or do a deep clone of Lodash or something. So anybody that is asking for the config, we have to send a copy of it, not the original environment. Otherwise, it's an object. They could just turn around and write into it.
I think I got what you're saying. I do apologize. I'm just getting slightly dodgy sound as you were speaking there. So, but I in my next branch, I think we're going to attack exactly what you're talking about. Okay, so can we hold that thought and try and extend that conversation? Is that all right?
Sounds good. Sounds good.
Okay.
Apologies for the sound. It's the ear talk. So
yeah, it's my end. It's not your fault. Right. Okay. So the other part of this this particular branch, I've got one other scenario kind of recipe for where I found the injectors play a part, and it's a conversation that I ended up having with a React specialist, because it turns out that React developers don't think in this way, so it's a bit confusing, and it's just worth sort of like talking about and seeing what you think. Okay, so if I go to the Injectors Demo, it's in this lib. Okay, I've got basically a module that's an outer module, and it's importing an outer container state module. It's got an other containers module, and then it's declaring an outer container component. All right. Now, what I'd like to show is inside here. Okay, inside the state module. Okay, what have we got? Oh. No, I think I've messed something up. Yes. Oh, I tricked myself there. There is a service, okay, that's provided in the outer container state module. But when I looked at the outer container state module, there wasn't a providers section because I'd done it in the tree shakeable way. So yeah, so the outer container state module has a provider for a service where I'm defining a test value as 0, okay? And then if I go back to that main module, do you remember the outer container component? If I go in there, I'm injecting that same service, I'm setting the test value to 99, and then if I go back to the module, I'm importing the other containers module, okay? And then it's declaring a component, and in the component, I'm injecting the same service, and then I'm interpolating the test value, okay? So hopefully that didn't sound too painful. So the point I'm trying to make, okay, as this spins up, I'm not quite sure why that's screaming at me, but we'll figure that out. The point that I'm trying to make is that the provider in this module makes its services available, so its singletons are available to this module, okay? And the confusing thing to my React developer colleague was that he couldn't understand how the provider in this one actually provided to this module when we're actually at this module level. Does it make sense? So we're talking 2 branches where the providers are shared because they're imported into a parent module. Okay, to some people, this is going to sound really simple, but I think that final piece there, the fact that the provider is accessible to components that are in the imported module, is confusing to some people who don't understand the provider tree. Does anybody have any questions about that?
No.
I thought you'd get it, Deval. I thought you'd get that. I thought you'd know that one. Okay, so that just demonstrates that right there. Okay, right. I think that's enough talking, seeing as nobody had any questions of that. That's obviously an easy one for us lot.
So I've got a question.
Yeah.
What is the use case for something like this? Why would you do that?
Why would you share a provider to an imported component? So imported module. So in the case where the imported module is kind of like an semi-agnostic container, you might want to import it into this overarching module to provide extra functionality, like services that depend on other services and such. Okay, so just an interesting way of sharing providers.
And this helps make the code that you've got reusable throughout, so you're not having to rewrite stuff. You've got everything in that one module. You can just share it wherever it's needed.
Yeah, the idea is that it is sort of creating more modular development. That's all. Okay.
But Tom, it does add to the complexity. Like when I'm looking at my module on its own in isolation, or the containers module, and I see a service injected, how would I know where it's coming from? Like it kind of is not so easy to understand from a layman's point of view, right?
It's not. This is really just an edge case that we were sort of trying to explore. In particular, Dav, it was about that pattern that we've been talking about recently. The view composer. Okay, and it relates to that. We were playing around with how we can, in a composition kind of way, drag this module in instead of another one, but still have access to the same services.
Yeah, makes sense.
Okay. Okay. Right. Let's move on to the fun part. Okay. The final frontier. Okay. So hopefully Val is going to pick up on this. But the idea here is where I work currently, we use a pattern called Enterprise Angular Monorepo patterns. Has anybody heard of this? Apart from maybe Max?
Are we allowed to answer?
Are we talking about NX?
Yeah, it's a pattern written by Victor Savkin.
Yep.
And several other guys. And yeah, we've had a show of hands. That was good. Thank you. So in which case you guys will have heard of a feature shell. Okay. And in this case, I've got a feature shell you'll see over here. And I go over to that module. The objective of a feature shell is to extract as much of the root code in the app into a shell library and then instantiate the rest of the app. So it's kind of like a root app, but it's a lib. So you're trying to reduce as much of the code in your app as possible. So in this case, I've just got the standard 4 files and the module, and I'll just show you what that's up to. I'm going to ignore that first bit, but basically its job is just to call the feature shell. Okay. Right, and you're seeing the problem right in front of you, but I will keep that open and I will jump into the actual code. Come on, let's go back. That'll do. Yeah, there we are. Right, so what you'll see here is I've extracted the previous stuff that I talked to you about. So Val, as you saw, we can use the app initializer inside a lib. Okay, so this is a module that's directly imported by the app module over here. And then you can use the app initializer to inject the config and get the async config file loaded from an HTTP client call. Meanwhile, we're also doing the store module, the NGRX store and effects initialization settings, the imports with the forRoots all set up. Okay, so the other thing that you might want to do with NGRX store is start the dev tools. I don't know if you've used Redux dev tools. I presume plenty of you have. Yeah. I'm seeing a nod. Hi, Quakes. I'm guessing quite a lot. Yeah, the Redux dev tools are excellent, but you don't want them working in production, okay? Because they give too much away about your code. And they probably make it a bit slower as well, to be quite honest. So the way that you normally do that is you use a sort of dynamic composition in your loader. Let's have a quick look. Okay, the way you do it is that, right? Now the problem with that is that this is not available to a lib. Right, you're welcome to raise questions about that, because that's the conundrum. All right, but what I found,
you froze for 10 seconds. If you could repeat the last statement.
Oh, that's a shame. Right, so this, the environment.production, is unavailable inside a lib, and the reason is the imports rule. Because the environments file exists in the root of the app, the lib cannot import that file. Okay, and you can't pass it in as a token, because a token is hydrated at runtime, whereas the import itself is defined at build time. Okay, so it's a build time runtime argument. And so, in other words, these two configurations, I don't have a better way than to keep them here and do the rest of the stuff in the feature shell. The important thing being with NGRX is that you have to define those two before you define the store dev tools, because it's dependent on it. So your imports have to be in that order. So that's why I've got this import first to do that job, and then finally call the dev tools. Any questions on that? Val, does that sort of speak to what you were talking about?
Yeah, no, that's a perfect answer, because the division of responsibility is met except for that environment, because the environment is for CLI and during the compilation. And let's say if you have even NX, but you want to bring somebody else's library in that depends on your environment, how are you going to do it? Now, as long as you publish that config module out of NX, then all libraries, they could build against it. Now they have access to the environment. Here is just, we have a little bit of chicken and egg for the NGRX, because you want to put, you want to do a clean design, put more of the stuff in the config, but A depends on B, B depends on A. So yeah.
Yeah, cool. Thank you, Val.
Good stuff. Thank you. Thank you.
It's good to be justified in that way. I appreciate your words. Okay. I think, have I did put in the chat the link to my repo, so that's all cool. So those of you who wanted to clone, you have. So I think that actually brings me to a close.
Tom,
right.
Is it a bad one question, sorry. Can we not extract the environment file to its own workspace library?
Oh, go on, say again, Dab, sorry.
So that environment Can that not be exposed as part of a library?
Oh, I'm kind of glad you brought that up. I wondered if anybody would. I've considered at some length about moving the environment files into a lib or like the feature shell even, and then doing the file replace in the Angular JSON just the way that we're doing an app. But I've thought about it and I thought, I don't like the idea of too much funky logic being in your Angular JSON. That's kind of like magic about what happens, okay, when it's so far from the vanilla kind of CLI developed app and CLI created libs. And that's the reason that I prefer this solution. It's just an acceptance of what you've been given, because I really do feel that environments should sit in the app. They're kind of self-defining. It's the root, you know, because when you make more apps that sit alongside, you don't want to tweak a lib. You want to tweak that app to sort of like compose the way you import those libs.
I agree. I think now that you mentioned that, the justification, yeah. I mean, as a default, you look for environment in an app rather than prodding through a library and it's easy to look at an environment for an app by looking at an app rather than having a monorepo with 10 apps, and where do the environments go then for each of those apps, right? It's hard to figure out. Okay, makes sense.
Cool.
But it's but referencing the environment file by relative path only works for what you develop. What if you have to rely on a module that is not yours, but that module requires the environment file? That is where actually, if you have a way to pass that environment file to the app, to the library, that would be great. But usually whenever or whoever that they write the app, and they figure out how to pass the environment in the app module.ts via forRoot.
Yeah, I think it kind of, to me, it feels like we need something extra from the way modules are constructed, because all of this happens at build time. And I wonder that maybe the actual solution might be in the forRoot. I personally believe that we should have imports available inside the object that gets returned, the module with providers. I think it should be module with providers and imports. And then I think we could do the really funky stuff.
By the way, Tom, I raised the ticket against the CLI, and I said the CLI knows where the environment is because it creates it based on other files. It would be really nice that the Angular that the CLI was made for makes the environment available via import from core/give me my environment. Then they could figure everything out among themselves, CLI and the Angular. We just imported the way that it's meant to be imported, but it was unfortunately declined.
I think it would be useful because it simplifies everything, what you're saying. Yeah. Shame they declined you. What can I say?
Yeah, unfortunately, you know, when it comes to Angular and being opinionated, so they know exactly what they want, and yeah, it's pretty hard to negotiate.
Yes, I've certainly found that myself. But I think the one thing that I would repeat, the strong feeling that I have about Angular is don't fix the framework. I found that people who try to create shortcuts around the framework to sort of effectively create a special service that does something funky often end up sort of tripping over improvements to the framework as it happens in the future. So it's kind of try to work within the limitations of what you got. Cool.
So one last question. Do you have a use case in mind that you need to have a config file from the API before you even bootstrap Angular?
So rather than the API, okay, in the case, in the projects that I'm working with currently, we have something extremely similar, a config JSON file that gives us the URLs to the APIs that are within that environment. So we would have like a CI environment, testing environment, a UAT environment, and all of those would have a different config file that gets deployed with the same bundle, the same built bundle that gets passed through all of those environments. So it's only built once and stored as a zip file, and then it has a different config file that sits beside it, and the CI creates that file from a stash of them that it's got, that it just passes out. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because you have to do an HTTP call to get that config file from the asset directory anyways.
Yes. Yeah, so potentially you could do it from an API as opposed to just a JSON file that sits in the root, you know, and it would provide the same sort of idea.
Great, thank you.
Tom, can I ask something about the configuration?
Absolutely, go ahead.
What if you have the configuration JSON file in your assets folder of your project? Would you again make an HTTP request to get it?
As I understand it, importing JSON files directly is not something that the Angular framework comes with straight away. You have to get a plugin, well, an NPM library that does that for you, and then you can import it as a JSON object. I mean, it is possible. You could put it in your assets folder and do it that way. And let me have a think about this. When it gets imported, I believe that it will become part of your build, and so therefore it defeats the problem. That's why it's loaded asynchronously. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks.
Oh, we've got one more from Dav.
Sorry, Tom, I forgot to lower my hand.
That's all right. It's nice that you waved at me. Anybody else before I wrap this up? Well, I think I've really gone on long enough.
One last thing, Tom, I wanted to ask, you know, it's not related to this demo, but when you were showing those async config initially, right? What I found, I ran across this problem and I wanted to point out is, you know, if I'm declaring, say that config eventually needs to be part of NGRX effect, okay? If it needs to be injected in an effect, okay?
Yes.
And you call effects store module dot effect, and you specify the effect in there, right?
Yes.
And that effect injects that config value, config token.
Mm-hmm.
And if I try to use it at that point, it won't be there, because it turns out that that effect got instantiated as part of the forRoot call before app initializer gets called. So the effect instance gets created straight away as soon as you call effect for feature or effect forRoot.
Wow.
So it doesn't even wait for your app initializer to execute its initializer. So if you inject something in your effect, right, which is dependent on app initializer doing its stuff, and you know, setting the value in your build config to some value, right, and you start in your effects constructor start accessing .config property, you would get null.
I got you. So, but to get around that, you could use that config token in the second part that would only instantiate itself once that's available. Could you not?
The second config token,
yes.
But again, that second config token, as soon as I inject it into the effect, it will start rehydrating itself, right? And the moment it starts rehydrating, it will try to say, can I get a config value which is not set yet, right? If I'm understanding, maybe I can talk offline or something, but
the config value, if you pass it as a token, then the token has to hydrate. before it can complete. It is in
Yes,
itself.
but if the token hydration depends upon your build config .config property being set through app initializer, right?
Yes.
So, and if that's not getting executed because effect constructor happens before your app initializer's factory runs, you know, that's where the problem is. That's where the race condition is. The effects constructor gets called first before your app initializer gets executed.
I'm with you. So in the instance that we're talking, are we able to inject the token in the constructor or not?
No, even if you inject, it will not give me the value. Like the token would start hydrating itself, and it will depend on a config to be loaded beforehand, right? So that config property would give me null. That's what I'm trying to say.
Wow.
So the problem is, how do we get around this? We have to, because we have to make sure that we access .config later on, not as part of, you know, constructor initialization. That's one workaround is I don't start accessing .config straight away. I wait for everything to sort out and wait for the actions to dispatch, and that lazy point in time I say .config, because by that time when I start .config, it will be populated. I think I'm probably not very clear, but I can show you sometime later.
Okay, I think I need to visually see it. I think you're right. That it sounds like there is a flaw there. Probably one we need to solve. Let's have a look at it. All right.
Yeah, sure.
Cool. Right. Well, I hope you've enjoyed things tonight. It's been great to have you all here. There's loads of you, and lots of cameras on. It's been really nice and cozy, considering we're spread so far apart. Yeah, wish you a good evening, and thanks for coming, and do come again.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you,
That was
Tom.
good.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye
Thank
now.
you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
See you.
Cheers.